Hello, welcome to The Secret Mind. We've had a couple of busy days of hypnosis, and it struck me we haven't done ghost stories in a while. And that means I am letting down the ghost story posse. Is that an appropriate thing to say? We were doing 3 books, and I started a story and I didn't continue it. That's not right, is it? This is the first one. Remember, this was by my form teacher in York. Here it is in a slide form. That's technology. I just read the next story, and that was just of an old man who appears at the top of a staircase. I mean, this is the problem with true stories. You know, you need a little bit of dramatisation. And he was a history teacher, so he wouldn't embellish a ghost story, would he, Mr. Mitchell? No. Nevertheless, the next one, which I haven't read, the reason I haven't read it, and I'm going to read it to you now, is that it's a place I know quite well, Holy Trinity Church in Micklegate. Not that well. I mean, I've been and I could tell you broadly where it is. It looks like that. That's one of those extraordinary drawings. Lithographs? I don't know, don't quote me. But it starts with this. It's appropriate that any tour of haunted York should begin with this fine church, for it is the setting of what has become one of the most famous of all the ghost stories connected with the city. So I didn't need to read it because it's definitely going to be included in this session. And that it's short. I mean, you've seen that's literally its length. So, ever since the Reverend S. Baring Gould, the writer of Onward Christian Soldiers, trivia fans, first collected the many eyewitness accounts in his book Yorkshire Oddities, this particular haunting has always been included in ghostly guides to the North Country. It is unique in that mention of it is even made on the church information board attached to the gate. The church has been much altered since the time of the hauntings, although enough of the structure remains to enable us to imagine the scene when the gallery at the west end of the nave gave such a clear view of the phenomena at the east. It must be remembered, however, that the present east window is not the one about which the story is told, nor is it in the original position. The present chancel was built about 1886 on the site of the great central tower of the original priory church. Come on, where are the ghosts? 3 very distinct figures were seen, always in broad daylight, and generally during the hours of morning service. One of the figures, referred to as the mother, was tall and graceful, 18 to 20 years of age, her face covered with a fine lace veil. This was the figure who showed such affection and despair. The second figure was described as a nursemaid, showing loving care of a child which she brings to the mother. Legend says that a father, mother and child lived near the church. When the father died, he was buried near the east window, but the child, dying later, had to be buried outside the city walls because of plague regulations. Soon afterwards, the mother died, and being buried in the husband's grave, now as in her lifetime continues to seek for her child and bemoan the separation. As has already been said, the building of the chancel seemed to bring an end to the appearances of these tragic figures. Perhaps the unquiet grave itself has been covered up, for there does not appear to have been any visual evidence of haunting since the 1890s, and the church is now quiet. Yet, only in 1957, a strange incident occurred, which was reported to me, him, by a teacher of religious knowledge in a local school. This lady, during one of York's festivals, was showing a keen historian round some of the ancient churches of York. About 9 o'clock in the evening, the 2 ladies came to Holy Trinity Church in the gathering dusk, neither of them knowing of the traditions of haunting connected with the building. As the historian examined the monuments in the fabric of the building, her friend stood, somewhat tired, in the crossing at the west end of the church, underneath the place where the gallery used to be. Suddenly, she noticed the atmosphere change to what she described as earthy and cold, a very Charnel house atmosphere of death and decay. It was not until 1964 that my informant heard of the tradition of haunting in the church and decided to visit the building once again. This time, all was well, and the atmosphere was free of any unpleasant aromas. Another tradition tells as that in the troubled days of Henry VIII, a party of soldiers coming to take possession of the convent once attached to this community met spirited reproval from the Reproval from the prioress, who barred the way and told them that only over her dead body would they enter God's property. Her courage resulted in her being cut down by their swords, though she vowed before dying that her spirit would haunt the site until what belonged to God was restored. Unfortunately, the legend must remain unfounded, for the convent attached to the priory was St Clement's in Clementhorpe, and we know that the last prioress was Isabel Ward, who lived in a house in Trinity Lane, leaving it to the poor of the parish when she died. The house still stands in the narrow lane to the east of the church and is in use with the delightful name of Jacob's Well for meetings. Well, it's not a killer story, that, is it? I mean, you know, there was some figures might have been seen in the 1880s. Then 75 years later, someone gets a bit cold seeing an old church, and then move on to another story. And that is one of the problems with real ghost stories, of the real ghosts. So we were experimenting with this book, weren't we, boys and girls? Which is, I mean, you can already tell, can't you? It looks a lot more salacious and interesting. So I don't know where we got up to. Did we do one about a cannibal? Are we doing cannibals today? Is that appropriate? You in the mood for a cannibal? I don't know. And now I've promised you cannibals, you're gonna, you know, maybe I should have read this beforehand. You can have a cannibal or a strangler. Alright, I'm going to give you a cannibal. It wouldn't be fair not to. The Fiend in Bandages. Only four men escaped when the British square-rigged yacht Pierrot capsized in the Atlantic in July 1884. Huddled in a battered dinghy, they drifted for 25 days. Near death from starvation and exposure, Captain Edwin Rutt then made a last desperate suggestion. Lots should be drawn to determine which of the four would be eaten. Two of the sailors agreed with Rutt, but 18-year-old Dick Tomlin, the youngest and therefore tastiest crewman, protested that he would rather die than eat human flesh. It's convenient. Tomlin's resistance sealed his fate. At the first opportunity, Rutt crept towards the sleeping boy and drove a neck into his neck. I mean, there's a lesson there, isn't there? There's a business lesson for all of us. Don't volunteer. The mate, Josh Dudley, and seaman Will Hoon had no reservations about cannibalism. Very open-minded. When they were rescued by the yacht Gellert 4 days later, it was the slain boy's flesh that had sustained them. The horror-stricken master of the Gellert rejected the idea of burial at sea. Hidden away underneath a tarpaulin, the body of the victim accompanied the three survivors to the Cornish port of Falmouth. All three were tried and condemned to death for murder on the high seas. But the Home Secretary decided that there had been horror enough and commuted the sentence to 6 months' imprisonment. No one could have known that the horrors were only beginning. When the three men were freed from jail, they found little future. To keep body and soul together, Josh Dudley found work as a drayman. 2 weeks later, his team of horses saw something that frightened them in the middle of a foggy London street. Bolting, they tossed Dudley to the cobblestones, where his head shattered. Witnesses said the thing in the fog had been a figure swathed from head to foot in blood-stained bandages. After Dudley's death, the figure mysteriously vanished. With fear beginning to take root, Captain Rutt went to the Soho slums and sought out Will Hoon. He fought the old seaman. He found the old seaman far gone in drink, a sodden derelict, in desperately bad health. Rutt told Hoon that some vengeance-crazed relative was masquerading as Dick Tomlin's ghost, and he urged Hoon to help him ferret out the plotter. But Hoon wanted only more gin, and in a last delirium he was taken to the charity ward of a hospital, where he died in a screaming fit. Witnesses said later that another patient, dressed all in bandages, had been holding Hoon down, apparently trying to soothe him. Then the patient vanished. Now in a state of abject terror, Rutt went to the police. They scoffed at his tales of a figure in bandages, but in view of the captain's mental condition, they offered him 1 night of lodging in a cell. Rutt went gratefully to the cell, checking twice to be sure he was locked in. It was a cell block for the disturbed of London, and screams in the night were not uncommon. But when at 3 a.m. the police heard the captain, some distinctive quality in his cries brought warders running. They unlocked the door and went to his bunk, where Rutt lay with his knees scissored upward and his dead eyes like marbles. Clenched in his fingers, the shocked bobbies saw shreds of cotton and blood-stained gauze. I mean, that's good, isn't it? More salaciously... I had a couple of shivers go down my spine there. I'm not going to lie to you. I ain't even going to lie to you. They dramatise... It's in the words, isn't it? How can things mysteriously vanish? Well, if you're vanishing... Okay, they can mysteriously vanish. I buy that. I enjoyed that. And it had a bit of, activity in the police cells. Those who would like to hear more about the police cells may be interested in one of my other video-logged strands, Unpunished Confessions of a... Not confessions, Submissions of a Police Doctor. Episode 4 coming soon. Please start from episode 1. And the third thing I was doing on the ghost thing was I was reading you a story, and the story was from here, and it was the Beckoning Fair One, which we decided was Oliver Onions' most famous story. You'll have to go and recap on there. It's such a long time ago, I've kind of forgotten. He was going to an old house, wasn't he? Anyway, I can't do great recaps yet, so I'm just trying to get my words in order and not scuff up too much. But this is about 10 or 11 chapters or something. No, more than 11. But we've only done one. 11 or 12 or something. So this is chapter 2 of the Beckoning Fair One. As far as the chief business of his life, his writing, was concerned, Paul Oleron treated the world a good deal better than he was treated by it. But he seldom took the trouble to strike a balance or to compute how far, at 45 years of age, he was behind his points on the handicap. To have done so wouldn't have altered matters, and it might have depressed Oleron. He had chosen his path and was committed to it, beyond possibility of withdrawal. Perhaps he had chosen it in the days when he'd be easily swayed by something a little disinterested, a little generous, a little noble. And had he ever thought of questioning himself, he would still have held it to it that a life without nobility and generosity and disinterestedness was no life for him. Only quite recently, and rarely, had he even vaguely suspected that there was more in it than this. But it was no good anticipating the day when he supposed he'd reached that maximum point of his powers beyond which he must inevitably decline, and be left face to face with the question whether it would not have profited him better to have ruled his life by less exigent ideals. In the meantime, his removal into the old house with the insurance marks built into its brick merely interrupted Romilly Bishop at the 15th chapter. As this tall man with the lean, ascetic face moved about his new abode, arranging, changing, altering, hardly yet into his working stride again, he gave the impression of almost spinster-like precision and nicety. For 20 years past, in a score of lodgings, garrets, flats, and rooms furnished and unfurnished, he'd been accustomed to do many things for himself, and he'd discovered that it saves time and temper to be methodical. He'd arranged with the wife of the long-nosed Barrett, a stout Welsh woman with a falsetto voice, the Merionethshire accent of which long residence in London had not perceptibly modified, to come across the square each morning to prepare his breakfast, and also to turn the place out on Saturday mornings. And for the rest, he even welcomed a little housework as a relaxation from the strain of writing. His kitchen, together with the adjoining strip of an apartment into which a modern bath had been fitted, overlooked the alley at the side of the house. and at one end of it was a large closet with a door and a square sliding hatch in the upper part of the door. This had been a powder closet, and through the hatch the elaborately dressed head had been thrust to receive the click and puff of the powder pistol. Oleron puzzled a little over this closet, then, as its use occurred to him, he smiled faintly. A little moved, he knew not by what. He would have to put it to a very different purpose from its original one. It would probably have to serve him as his larder. It was in this closet that he made a discovery. The back of it was shelved, and rummaging on an upper shelf that ran deeply into the wall, Oleron found a couple of mushroom-shaped old wooden wig stands. He did not know how they had come to be there. Doubtless the painters had turned them up somewhere or other and had put them there, but his 5 rooms as a whole were short of cupboard and closet room, and it was only by the exercise of some ingenuity that he was able to find places for the bestowal of his household linen, his boxes, and his seldom used but not to be destroyed accumulations of papers. It was in early spring that Oleron entered on his tenancy, and he was anxious to have Romilly ready for publication in the coming autumn. Nevertheless, he did not intend to force its production. Should it demand longer in the doing, so much the worse. He realised its importance, its crucial importance in his artistic development, and it must have its own length and time. In the workroom he had recently left, he had been making excellent progress. Romilly had begun, as the saying is, to speak and act of herself, and he did not doubt she would continue to do so the moment the distraction of his removal was over. This distraction was almost over. He told himself it was time he pulled himself together again, and on a March morning he went out, returned again with 2 great bunches of yellow daffodils, placed one bunch on his mantelpiece between the Sheffield sticks, and the other on the table before him, and took out the half-completed manuscript of Romilly Bishop. But before beginning work, he went to a small rosewood cabinet and took from a drawer his cheque-book and passbook. He totted them up, and his monk-like face grew thoughtful. His installation had cost him more than he'd intended it should, and his balance was rather less than £50, with no immediate prospect of more. I'd forgotten rugs and chintz curtains and so forth mounted up so, said Oleron. But it would have been a pity to spoil the place for the want of £10 or so. Well, Romilly simply must be out for the autumn, that's all, so here goes. He drew his papers towards him, but he worked badly. Or rather, he didn't work at all. The square outside has its own noises, frequent and new, and Oleron could only hope that he would speedily become accustomed to these. First came hawkers with their carts and cries. At midday the children returning from school trooped into the square and swung on Oleron's gate, and when the children had departed again for afternoon school, an itinerant musician with a mandolin posted himself beneath Oleron's window and began to strum. This was a not unpleasant distraction, and Oleron, pushing up his window, threw the man a penny. Then he returned to his table again. But it was no good. He came to himself at long intervals to find that he had been looking out about his room and wondering how it had been formerly furnished, whether a settee and buttercup or petunia satin had stood under the farther window, whether from the centre moulding of the light, lofty ceiling had depended a glimmering crystal chandelier, or whether tambour frame or the piquet table had stood. No, it was no good. He had been far better frankly been doing nothing than getting fruitlessly tired, and he decided that he would take a walk, but chancing to sit down for a moment, dozed in his chair instead. This won't do, he yawned when he awoke at 4:30 in the afternoon. I must do better than this tomorrow. And he felt so deliciously lazy that for some minutes he even contemplated the breach of an appointment he had for the evening. The next morning he sat down to work without even permitting himself to answer one of his 3 letters. 2 of them tradesmen's accounts, the third a note from Miss Bengow, forwarded from his old address. It was a jolly day of white and blue, with a gay, noisy wind and a subtle turn in the colour of growing things. And over again, once or twice a minute, his room became suddenly light and then subdued again, as the shining white clouds rolled northeastwards over the square. The soft, fitful illumination was reflected in the polished surface of the table, and even in the foot-worn old floor, and the morning noises had begun again. Oleron made a pattern of dots on the paper before him, and then broke off to move the jar of daffodils exactly opposite the centre of a creamy panel. Then he wrote a sentence that ran continuously for a couple of lines, after which it broke on into notes and jottings. For a time he succeeded in persuading himself that in making these memoranda he was really working. Then he rose and began to pace his room. As he did so, he was struck by an idea. It was that the place might possibly be a little better for more positive colour. It was perhaps a thought too pale, mild and sweet as a kind old face, but a little devitalised, even wan. Yet decidedly it would bear a robuster note, more and richer flowers, and possibly some warm and gay stuff for cushions for the window seats. Of course, I really can't afford it, he muttered, as he went for a 2-foot and began to measure the width of the window recesses. In stooping to measure a recess, his attitude suddenly changed to one of interest and attention. Presently he rose again, rubbing his hands with gentle glee. Oh, he said. These look very much like window boxes nailed up. We must look into this. Yes, these are boxes, or... Oh, this is an adventure. On that wall of his sitting room there were 2 windows. The third was in another corner, and beyond the open bedroom door on the same wall was another. The seats of all had been painted, repainted, and painted again, and Oleron's investigating finger had barely detected the old nailed heads beneath the paint. Under the ledge, over which he stooped, an old keyhole also had been putted up. Oleron took out his penknife. He worked carefully for 5 minutes and then went into the kitchen for a hammer and chisel. Driving the chisel cautiously under the seat, he started the whole lid slightly. Again using the penknife, he cut along the hinged edge and outward along the ends, and then he fetched a wedge and a wooden mallet. "Now for our little mystery," he said. The sound of the mallet on the wedge seemed, in that sweet and pale apartment, somehow a little brutal, nay, even shocking. The panelling rang and rattled and vibrated to the blows like a sounding board. The whole house seemed to echo from the roomy cellarage to the garrets above a flock of echoes. From the roomy cellarage to the garrets above, a flock of echoes seemed to awake, and the sound got a little on Oleron's nerves. All at once he paused, fetched a duster, and muffled the mallet. When the edge was sufficiently raised, he put his fingers under it and lifted. The paint flaked and starred a little. The rusty old nails squeaked and grunted, and the lid came up, laying open the box beneath. Oleron looked into it. Save for a couple of inches of scurf and mould and old cobwebs, it was empty. "No treasure there," said Oleron, a little amused that he should have fancied there might have been. "Romilly will still have to be out by the autumn. Let's have a look at the others." He turned to the second window. The raising of the 2 remaining seats occupied him until well into the afternoon. That of the bedroom, like the first, was empty. But from the second seat of his sitting room, he drew out something yielding and folded and furred over an inch, thick with dust. He carried the object into the kitchen, and having swept it over a bucket, took a duster to it. It was some sort of a large bag, of an ancient frieze-like material, and when unfolded, it occupied the greater part of the small kitchen floor. In shape it was a very irregular triangle, and it had a couple of wide flaps, and with the remains of straps and buckles. The patch that had been uppermost in the folding was of a faded yellowish brown, but the rest of it was shades of crimson that had varied according to the exposure of the parts of it. "Now whatever can these have been?" Oleron mused as he stood surveying it. "I give it up. Whatever it is, it's settled my work for today, I'm afraid." He folded the object carelessly and thrust it into a corner of the kitchen. Then, taking pans and brushes and an old knife, he returned to the sitting room and began to scrape and to wash and to line with paper his newly discovered receptacles. When he'd finished, he put his spare boots and books and papers into them, and he closed the lids again, amused with his little adventure, but also a little anxious for the hour to come, when he should settle fairly down to his work again. So that's that. Much longer form, not a lot happens, but this is a classic story. This is a really famous story. So this is going to take off at some point, just not today. So they're my 3 stories. See you tomorrow.